Hi everybody. We're going to talk about using motion today in our photography. How do we use it? Actually use it. We're typically concerned about stopping it, right? We worry about our shutter speed, we worry about using the tripod so we don't have any shake. We look at panning. We do things to try and stop the sense of motion, but there are a lot of other things to do with motion and ways to use it to your advantage. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. And this is also a topic, by the way, that I went over in my meetup group. So if you're in the meetup.com, if you're in the meetup groups and photography groups and you're in the Houston area or you're coming to the Houston area, check out Bay Area Photo Club. That's my group, and we do all this based on the seeing, not the taking concepts of my book. So I hope to see you there. But anyway, motion. Couple things to think about. We have a few things to think about, actually. In using motion, we have to consider the shutter speed, of course. If we're looking at the shutter speed, we have to concern ourselves with how we brace the camera, film speed or sensitivity, neutral density filters, panning, fixed focus, mixed with flash and slow shutter, angle of motion, angle of view. Let's talk about those. When you're using motion, in other words, not trying to stop it, okay? If we want to stop motion, we go to a fast shutter speed. Got it? Okay. If you're trying to minimize motion, you can make sure that the subject's far away so it doesn't cover as much space in the viewfinder or the image space. Got it. We're using motion. In this situation, we're using motion. So with the shutter speed, the slower you go with the shutter speed, of course, the more the sense of motion. Well, the interesting thing too is once you get it slow enough, then the motion disappears. Okay? And what I mean by that, if you're photographing somebody running by and you photograph at a 500th of a second, you'll probably stop them, right? But if you photograph over 30 seconds, that blur will take up such a small period of the exposure time that you may not even see it. Now, what you may see is the foot plant on the ground of the runner, but everything above it will be gone. Okay, so that's using motion. We can use motion to make things go away because they pass through the scene so quickly over the longer exposure that you don't even see them. So we use the shutter speed to convey motion, but also to almost over display the motion so it goes away. If you're using the slow shutter speed, of course, you need to be able to brace the camera. When you're talking about really slow shutter speeds, you need a tripod. You need some sort of brace. Tripod's good. Tables if you have to. There's all sorts of solutions, but the point is you're going to brace the camera. Now, some of the things that we'll talk about, though, is if you're using a fourth of a second, a full second, if you stand with your feet apart, with your wings in, you may be able to hold it well enough that your own motion helps show the motion you're trying to convey in the image. Okay? If you're trying to show how kinetic your little child is, how constantly moving the 2-year-old is, well then you may be fine shooting a slower shutter speed handheld because your motion and the child's motion work together to create an interesting sense of energy and movement. So you're bracing the camera except when you're not. Film speed, obviously the higher you go in the film speed, okay, the faster the shutter speed. Well, if you're using the faster and faster shutter speed, then you may actually be losing the sense of motion. So you want to be able to play with your film speed to get the sense of motion that you want. And the beauty of digital work, of course, is that you're changing your film speed from image to image if you want to. Experiment, play. This is supposed to be fun. Neutral density filters, there's a lot of that happening nowadays. I saw a YouTube hack on, I wish I could remember where, but it was creating your own neutral density filters out of welder's glass. You know, the welder's helmets, they're the shields that they put down. That's very thick glass, dense glass. And the photographer was using that as a neutral density filter. But if you use a heavy neutral density filter in daylight, you'll still be able to get shutter speeds down to, seconds instead of fractions of seconds. Panning, of course, is when you move with the subject, and if the camera and the subject are moving together, then it's the background that seems to be moving relative to those two. Well, you can do that. What happens if you pan backwards? Subject's going this way, you pan that way. What does that sense of motion look like? What happens if you almost opposite of panning, what would that be? Anti-panning, where the subjects are moving, but you've got it fixed on the scene. I photographed a steeplechase race at the University of New Mexico years ago, and some of my favorite images were actually the runners moving over the barricade. The image of the barricade was frozen, and the long shutter speed just had this kind of movement of humanity going over the barricade. The fixed focus, what I mean by that as a consideration is that if something's moving, it's kind of a trick that's been used in the sports photography days back when we didn't have automatic focus on everything. But do you find a fixed point, focus on that fixed point, and then take your photograph when the moving subject hits that plane of focus? Even with automatic focus as an option, we may want to go to a manual focus, click a fixed focus spot, and then use that as where we're going to capture the motion, show the motion, whatever it is that our concept is for the photograph. Mixed with flash and slow shutter speed, I love that technique. I love that process. When you're using a flash unit and a slow shutter speed, that lets the ambient light fill in. And you can do this from 15th of a second to 2 seconds. Back in, I think it was 1968 Democratic Convention is the one I remember first seeing this use where they got this whole sense of energy and almost chaos on the floor of the Democratic Convention using flash and a slow shutter speed. And I don't remember who the photographer was, but it was really kind of breathtaking as to how that works. I've used that for special events. I've used that for portraits. It's a wonderful blend of the light comes in from the flash, and then the ambient light adds color and fills in shadows. Try that. It's a wonderful thing. Angle of motion. If the camera is looking this way, the sense of motion is more dramatic as the subject moves across the plane than coming into it. The closer to perpendicular those two lines are of the lens and the movement, the closer to perpendicular they are, the more obvious the motion is. So if you're trying to use the motion, create a sense of motion, then you want to pay attention at the angle that you have relative to the motion as it goes through the image space. And then, of course, the angle of view. How is motion conveyed from a high angle of view versus a low angle of view, perspective that way. But also the angle of view of the lens. Okay? If you have a wide angle lens and the subject can only move through a little bit of space during the exposure time, that motion won't be so noticeable. It's kind of like taking a photograph of the sky and the stars move that much, in your 30-second exposure. That's not as noticeable as the helicopter that flew by. Okay? So, think in terms of the angle of the view of the lens. Okay? How much of that angle do you want the motion to go through during your shutter speed? We can use this with zoom blur. In other words, you're zooming while you take the photograph. That can have some amazing effects. My oldest son's very involved in the student bonfire at Texas A&M, and I had use zoom and a blur effect as I was photographing where the axe head was hitting the tree. And as the axe head hit the tree, there was a zoom effect. And several people that I showed that image to said it made them nauseous. It's a very powerful force. Just don't make it gimmicky. Subject movement where you're panning, we already talked about that. Subject moving where it's fixed, that's like the race that I told you about, the track race. Obliterating items, like I said, you can make things go away. Okay, with a long enough shutter speed, they'll just move, they'll go through and they'll disappear from the scene. That's a pretty powerful tool that we don't use enough, I think, as photographers, is using motion. Don't be afraid of it. Use it to make things disappear. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? We can blend colors. A friend of mine, Bill Barber, did some great things by zooming with slow shutter speeds and moving the camera, and the colors just washed together. It almost looked more like paintings. I mean, it was beautiful work, beautiful work. And think about what that effect can look like. Again, this is all about how to use motion to convey what you see and what your imagination sees. And then ghost images. If you have just a little bit of movement, there's almost that ghostly effect. Are you taking a photograph of a person and you want another person walking behind them, almost ghost-like? You're taking a portrait of somebody who does seances. Okay, well, that may be a way to take that portrait. Use a slow shutter speed with the flash, take the image, have the people moving through. Bingo, you got it. That's how you use motion. That's how you use motion in photography. It opens up a whole new door. Now go create something. Remember, in every moment, your vision is based on what you see. That's where it all happens. Go create something.